Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another Doctor Who book review. In today's review, I'm going to be continuing taking a look at the Doctor Who target novelisation releases of 2023. In today's review, the 13th Doctor Series 11 story, Kerblam, as written by Pete McTighe. Not gonna lie, I really enjoyed reviewing the Waters of Mars target novelisation, so I thought I would come back to take a look at another release. I initially didn't plan on doing this, however I think it is interesting seeing a Doctor Who story under a different lens, and Doctor Who books aren't exactly something that get as much attention these days, so I thought it would be something that will be worth taking a look at, in particular Kerblam, as I think it's probably one of the more highly regarded 13th Doctor stories. So this book is of course available to order now, as well as be purchased from all good bookshops throughout the UK, as well as of course also being online with various online retailers, the likes of Amazon, Penguin and all of that. So perhaps one of the main reasons why this review might be quite interesting is that I often avoid talking about the 13th Doctor era publicly, as more than often it causes arguments and unpleasantness, especially on social media. I can't lie, I don't really want that in my life, especially over a review that I've spent time out of my day actually creating. With target novelisations, however, I hope it's a different story, quite literally. After all, target novelisations take time and effort to read, unlike watching a TV story, which is over literally in the case of an hour. I'd hope that the vast majority of people who are reading Kerblam are either fans of the 13th Doctor era, or generally enjoyed the story, or like many new series targets, the reader wishes to hear what the writer has to expand upon now that they are free from the limits of the televised format. As a story anyway, I did rather enjoy Kerblam. I think it's definitely one of the gems within the early days of the 13th Doctor era. It's one of my personal favourite 13th Doctor era stories, and I think it brilliantly captures that boldness that we see within the older Doctor Who serials, especially from the 80s era of the show. This target novelisation is for the most part a rather faithful adaptation of the TV narrative, so again, if you've watched the TV story, you know what to expect from within this book. But that's completely okay, that's how the target novelisations are meant to be. But also at the same time, as I mentioned within my review of the Waters of Mars, due to these targets being released in an entirely different environment to the classic releases all them years ago, perhaps expectations have slightly changed due to the ease of access that we now have to being able to watch these new series stories over and over again. Within this book, we do have additional references and scenes added in by Pete McTighe, which I think give the story more force. It feels more real and places Kerblam into an actual society, rather than being its own isolated thing. The planet of Kandoka is present multiple times throughout the adventure, mostly featuring within flashbacks. The reader is given glimpses into the life of Judy Maddox and her childhood, but most importantly, Pete provides a commentary on the rise of Kerblam, the early stages of automation, and the effect that this had on the Kandokan people. The rise in rebellion and the riots of replacing a human workforce, which, let's face it, are incredibly relevant within the year of 2023 when reading this book, as we are starting to see certain workplaces and jobs being affected by cyber, space and technology and artificial intelligence. So it's a problem that we've got now, and it's certainly one that isn't going away. So this does naturally affect Judy's life personally, which then gives the character additional layers, and she's now the head of people at Kerblam when the 13th Doctor and her friends arrive. This angle, featuring the citizens rising up, gives the story a dystopian feel, but also showcases how such efforts were later defeated, with Kerblam gaining the entirety of Kandokan's moon and making it into a giant warehouse. Personally, I really enjoy these additional chapters. It really fleshes out the story, and I would have loved to have seen even more, maybe even showcasing the early iterations of Kerblam with the twirly robots actually being in action, and slowly seeing Kerblam infiltrate the Kandokan society. But But very much like how I mentioned within my review of The Waters of Mars, target novelisations for the new series aren't simply about adding in new material and making the story as different as possible from the TV episode. It's all about balance and still retaining that quick read nature that the target novelisations always had, and that the vast majority of the Terrance Dicks adaptations are infamously known for. The 13th Doctor and her companions are also written rather well. I think Pete captures 13's excitement for travelling, but also her bubbly childlike nature, which is reflective of her Series 11 adventures. Although the story still suffers from having way too many companions. In some ways this does benefit the story as we start to see multiple different areas within Kerblam operations, but beyond this the companions don't particularly have too much to do, other than say the odd remark here and there to push the mystery of the missing employees forward. I'd say, however, that this is more a fault of the era rather than the book itself. After all, you can't change and polish up everything. But what I do like within this book is that, not to give too much spoilers away, but I like the way that Pete has reapproached this story with the hindsight of the stories that also follow this one within the era. So we start to see little references and things creeping in, which I think start to showcase some of those character developments that are very, very subtly implied within the era, but aren't perhaps as obvious to most Doctor Who fans, which I think is one of the main criticisms for this era when people say character developments come out of nowhere, because more than often it's in a throwaway piece of dialogue and then it's not really talked about again, and you really need to dig deep into the story to actually see those character developments taking place. This story brings that a little bit more to the forefront. Yaz has a few references to her investigative policing side, which I rather appreciated, and Ryan appears to be constantly nervous or hesitant throughout, which I was kind of hoping that this would go into a little bit more detail. Maybe even Ryan discussing his anxiety or dyspraxia struggles, especially when on the conveyor belt in the later half of the story as they jump down to the lower levels of Kerblam, but this doesn't take place. Graham also has a nice bond with the character of Charlie, who works in the cleaning department, which again I think has more time to develop compared to what we got to see on screen. Kyra and Charlie's relationship is also explored in a little bit more detail. There's a few clumsy exchanges which are featured throughout, which certainly give the employees more personality. A reoccurring method within new series target novelisations is introducing further character context through the use of backstories, moments that have led that specific character to this point within their life, such as seeing how Kyra has gone up the ranks within Kerblam, or her life and background beyond Kerblam, or maybe even Charlie and who he was before he was an employee. Which I do certainly like throughout this story, but again it's a balance of priorities between who gets these backstories and who doesn't. The consequences of this does leave a few of the characters a little bit overlooked, or focusing a bit too much on other characters, meaning the rest of Kerblam doesn't receive as much attention. So for example, Lee Mack's character is sadly introduced and basically departs the story within a matter of pages, which although those pages give him adequate backstory, I would have liked to have him within the episode just a little bit more. The way that Pete has approached this story is that he hasn't really introduced any characters that he doesn't need to. There's no additional dialogue from extras or anything like that, so we focus primarily on those central characters to the narrative, which means that we basically know everyone incredibly quickly. So for the target format, this really makes sense, as it makes the episode really easy to follow, and I'm very surprised to say I actually read this book in a matter of hours, which is very unlike me. But I think that that's complementary to Pete's way of writing. It doesn't overcomplicate, it takes the reader on a journey, and despite presenting a very similar narrative to the TV show, the biggest strengths that this target has is giving the plot breathing space to develop those scenes through additional pieces of dialogue, but the way that new material is brought in is incredibly careful and considered. The chapters that have been added haven't really been added for the sake of it, they add to the story whilst also providing a little bit of good old fan service in there as well. There's some really lovely moments that definitely couldn't happen within the TV show, and I think that that's definitely Pete McTighe's fan side showing when writing this one. So for example, for the breathing space, especially the ending of this story, there is a few additional scenes and paragraphs, which although still brief, I think give the ending of the story a more rounded conclusion, rather than most of the stories within Series 11, where I think the pacing and the scene speeds were absolutely all over the place, so before you could even gauge and respond to the conclusion of the story, the episode was basically over, and the end credits were rolling. Meanwhile, you'd have other scenes in the early half of the story that go on for much longer than they need to. I think that this story fixes that pacing, but also goes into a bit more explanation as to why the episode unfolds how it does, why certain characters have acted how they have, and I think that I've came from this story with a bit of a better understanding as to why Kerblam does have the outcome that it does, but also ultimately giving the humans that opportunity to step in the future and kind of take action into their own hands, rather than having a company that is basically entirely robot generated. We start to see the role of the human coming to the forefront and the main role that they have to play within the universe, whilst also integrating these machines into their society in a more healthy way. For me, the main selling point of a new series target novelisation is allowing the writer of the TV episode to have complete freedom to expand their own adventure and not have the constraints perhaps provided by the production within that time period, or even just the general constraints of it being a televised visual TV story. I think that this means that the writers basically have the whole sandpit to play with. They can do whatever they want, whilst also just padding out what we've already got to see, making it a nice nostalgic experience, especially if you enjoyed the televised episode, but also allowing more time to actually engage with the concepts and ideas that these episodes have to offer. So if you liked Kerblam as a story, then I definitely recommend getting this target novelisation. At the end of the day, it's more 13th Doctor content, and there is rather limited 13th Doctor content out there, I think it is safe to say, so it's a new way to experience the story. But also, I would hope that maybe this release maybe gives those who are less convinced about the episode something to actually think about and be able to see the episode in a different light. But equally, if you're someone who really doesn't like the story, really doesn't like the 13th Doctor era, really doesn't like the characters that this episode has within it, then naturally I don't need to say the obvious, but just avoid this target novelisation because it's going to do very little for you. So there we go, that is another Target review. Once again, I've rather enjoyed discussing this story, and hopefully I may also review a few others as well from this series. I am currently reading Planet of the Ood, so who knows, I may review that one. So yes, hope you've enjoyed, have a nice day, and I shall see you all next time.